All right, welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. We are going to be tackling something today that I think you're going to find really interesting. It's this whole thing about NGOs and how they're involved in immigration. And, well, let's be honest, the funding for all that is kind of controversial, to say the least.
Yeah, it's definitely a hot button issue these days.
It is. And we've got this report here. It's called NGOs Funneled Billions of Tax Dollars. Pretty dramatic title, huh?
Yeah, definitely grabs your attention.
Oh, yeah. And you know our listeners love getting into the nitty-gritty of complex systems. So well, I think this is going to be right up their alley. We're going to look at the facts. We're not taking sides. We're just going to see what's what. So, okay, right off the bat, this thing about billions of dollars kind of jumps out at me. Like, how much money are we actually talking about here? And where's it going?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's kind of the point, right? To raise
Huh.
eyebrows. But yeah, the report zeroes in on taxpayer money, going to these NGOs, and it suggests, well, there might be some issues with oversight. It makes you wonder, are they using the money the right way? And is it actually getting where it's supposed to be going?
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Now, I see they named some specific organizations in here. Uh, anything that stands out?
Well, it's a pretty diverse group, which is interesting. So you've got your religious organizations, right, like Catholic Charities. They got a whopping $1.4 billion in government support.
Wow.
Yeah. And then there's Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. I think it's LIRS for short.
Okay.
Their funding went from like 93.1 million in 2021 to, get this, over 182.6 million the next year. So 2022, big jump.
Huh.
And then you've got like Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, HIAS. They're putting 17 million specifically towards helping Latin American migrants in 2024. So that's a very targeted effort.
Yay.
Yeah. And then there's Church World Service. They're reporting like over 20.5 million in grants in 2022. But the thing is, over 40% of their assets, where'd that come from? Taxpayer money.
Why?
Even Samaritan's Purse. They're usually known for like international disaster relief, right?
Right.
They got 29 million from USAI. Some of that's going toward helping immigrants in Latin America. And then we can't forget about Caritas. They're giving out 12 million to Latin American migrants through debit cards and cash vouchers.
Man, that is a lot of money. And it's not just one group either. It's like it's all over the place. And it sounds like this isn't just about stuff happening at the U.S. border. It's overseas too, right?
Exactly.
So it's not just about border crossings then. I mean, what are these groups actually doing with all this money?
That's a great question. And, the report goes into that a bit. It seems like, it really varies. So Catholic Charities, for instance, they're providing things like shelter, food, even travel assistance to migrants. Yeah. HIS, they're working directly with the UN and US agencies on, all things immigration and refugee related. And then there's this whole other layer of programs run by government agencies like DHS, USAID, FEMA. They funnel money to NGOs too.
So, wow, we're talking a huge range of activities here. So it
Yeah.
really makes you wonder what the impact is. I mean, this report says that these NGOs are practically funding the crisis.
Yeah.
Like, is that really what's going on?
Oh, that's a very loaded statement, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. I think a lot depends on how you define, the crisis to begin with. But the report, it does highlight a couple of things that are pretty interesting. Like, first of all, it says migrants who are getting help from these NGOs, they're ending up in almost every single congressional district. So
Mhm.
whatever the impact is, it's definitely being felt across the whole country. And then the second thing is it really points to sanctuary cities as bearing, a lot of the cost. And I guess that makes sense because these are cities with policies that, try to limit how much they cooperate with federal immigration enforcement. So you can see how the report might be suggesting that there's a link between what the NGOs are doing, where the migrants are ending up, and the strain on resources in certain areas, right?
Yeah, I can see that. It definitely raises a lot of questions. I mean, if NGOs are providing aid, right, and they're helping migrants relocate, like, what does that mean for all these communities? I mean, is there actually a connection between what they're doing and the challenges that certain cities or regions are facing?
Right. And it's complicated, it's a
Yeah.
really complex issue
Mm.
because on the one hand, you have these NGOs stepping in and they're trying to fill the gaps, right? They're providing really essential services to people who are, let's face it, very vulnerable. But on the other hand, you have all these concerns like, what about the strain on resources? And are there unintended consequences that, nobody's really thinking about? And then, of course, there's the whole lack of transparency thing, right? Like, how is this money actually being used?
Yeah, that's a good point. So it seems like this report is, well, it's raising more questions than it's answering.
Maybe that was the point.
Right. We see all this money going to these NGOs, but what the impact of all that funding is, that's still kind of murky.
Yeah.
And it feels like there needs to be, more transparency, more accountability, and we really have to think about the bigger picture, like all of the consequences, good and bad, of what's happening here.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And that's where the real deep dive begins, right? We got to look beyond the headlines. We got to think about the nuances. And here's a question I bet our listeners will find interesting. Like, what if these NGOs weren't providing these services? Who would? What would it mean for the migrants, the communities, the government? It's a lot to unpack.
That's such a good question. I mean, it's clear these NGOs, they play such a complicated role in all this. And it can be controversial, there's no doubt about that. But the impact, well, we can see it all across the country. And it's something we really need to think about carefully. We need to understand this better.
Absolutely. This deep dive, it's a good starting point, but the conversation definitely shouldn't end here.
You got that right. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Keep asking those questions, folks, and keep digging into this. It's a big issue with a lot of moving parts. See you next time.
See ya.